Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst the news items we have for you this week, the power of placebo is touted by the New York Times, but not without a number of demerits. A case study of an 80-year-old woman who found a rather unexpected foreign object in her brain. Cannibalism was the norm not that long ago, or at least so claims the study. Low-flying helicopters caused crocodiles to turn into bonobos in Australia by choosing to hump anything and everything within sight. There is a somewhat controversial conference, or at least result to a conference, in that a number of men have claimed to be females. The ISS continues to experience issues over Russian elements given the leaking of coolant, and they test for AI, or at least AI's general intelligence. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Starting with placebos. Placebos are effectively just tablets that contain 0 active ingredients, but as a result, people think they will do something, and so there is a mind over matter sort of scenario. Because of this, they are able to feel better even if they're not better. It's effectively the same thing as naturopathy, except naturopathy and homeopathy all have this slightly negative element attached to them in that they charge considerably more than what a placebo would cost. This is where the New York Times and a lead researcher, let's say, into placebos, creates a problem. Ted J. Kapchuk is the director of Harvard's placebo research department, and they wrote the article for the New York Times. The editorial is at least reasonable in that it summarizes the available information at present. The problem is that it is considerably more biased than is good. In this case, the bias is not so much about the research. As said, it summarizes it quite well. The problem is that it summarizes the author's research primarily, given that that is what they focus on. As you can imagine, when you are talking about your own work, you're likely to put it in the best possible light, and this includes trying to present it as the sole and complete answer to any question, something that's not really true in most cases. Most research will either eventually be built on, or it will be proven to be incorrect. In either case, if you are in that position, your work itself is just one block in a much larger structure. Therefore, you cannot be the sole and complete answer. This is where placebos kind of fall apart. They claim to be an answer, but they're not. In fact, we would be able to say that the entire article is almost premised on the idea of setting it up as a natural, safe, and completely effective alternative, which really isn't the case. What it's there for in most cases is to act as a control, to know if there is a uncontrollable variable in the form of giving someone something, and that will make them feel better. In this case, they present it as being something along the lines of a cause of health improvements caused by ritual symbols and behaviors involved with healing. But placebos cannot heal by their very definition. This is why they are an essential and often powerful tool in any and all clinical trials. That is because you can subtract the placebo effect from the treatment group, and from this you can then establish what kind of effect or the magnitude of effect the treatment actually has. For example, if you see the same benefit from placebo and treatment, you know the treatment isn't doing much of anything, if nothing at all. If instead, after subtracting the placebo effect from the treatment effect, and the treatment effect still has a positive value, you know that it has some effect. The degree of that effect is then able to be measured as something of value. And because of this, they can also be a useful way of controlling for variables like research participants wanting to, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, please the researchers by reporting positive outcomes. If the control group, the placebo group, reports similar outcomes to the treatment group or experimental group, then you know that the reports probably aren't based in any real changes, or rather it's in either perceived changes or the attempt to report something more optimistically than reality would really indicate. And this is also where the New York Times creates a bit of a faux pas, let's say. The issue here is that they describe placebos as partly as being unethical, which is just bullshit, because if you are running a clinical trial, the whole idea of the clinical trial is to establish whether or not it works. There's nothing unethical about giving two different treatments in this context because people have signed up knowing that they have a chance of getting the treatment group allocation or the control group allocation. Everybody has informed consent. To a degree, you don't even need to rely on a innocuous and inert substance as a placebo. You could instead be giving people something relatively harmless, for example, low-dose aspirin. This, presuming the individual doesn't have blood clotting issues, is not going to cause any harm whatsoever, and as a result, they're going to see some change in their body. They'll experience minor effects of the medication, but it won't really have any effect on the condition for which you are trying to investigate an outcome. As a result, you're not going to really be having any negative effects on someone. It's not as though you are harming them, you're just not giving them the treatment. Science-based medicine goes into a great deal more detail on the criticisms of this study, and we'll link that in the description box below. But it clearly shows that the article itself, although initially promising, very quickly falls into the trap of trying to present what is very, let's say, dubious evidence in the best possible light, and they outline the clear and distinct criticisms of it. Moving to actual medicine, and this time something that shows real results, gene-edited pig kidneys have been transplanted to a monkey. Although that isn't news. That's actually quite old now. What is important is that that happened 2 years ago, and the monkey is not only well and truly alive, but appears to have had no negative outcomes. Although that's saying something. The monkey's probably going to have been put to sleep, woken up and gone, "Shit, they took my kidney."
Yeah. Goodbye, Charlie. Yeah, goodbye, Charlie.
Goodbye? What? Hey, what's going on here? Hello? Who is that? Oh, what happened? Oh, they took my freaking kidney.
The key here, rather than the developments around the unicorns and stealing the monkey kidney, is that it's a genetically modified kidney taken from a pig and put into the monkey. The genetic modification is key here, as what they have done is remove any and all triggers for the immune system, or at least the most significant of them. And by doing this, they're able to take pig kidneys and, if things proceed the way they are, conduct clinical trials of putting them in humans. This means that we now have arguably, a viable resource for pig kidneys to be put into humans to address the not insignificant shortcoming of available organ donors, or more accurately, the shortcoming of people willing to donate kidneys as organ donors. The significance of the results are not necessarily the kidney itself, although to be clear, that is a major achievement. Rather, the key here is longevity and proof of concept. That is, you can take a genetically modified kidney, put it into a living being, and it will work with no adverse effect. There are some very clear advantages to using the pig kidney over the human kidney, and one reason why it may be preferred over organ donors. In terms of human donors, the kidney received, or more accurately the kidney donated, will still trigger the immune system of the recipient. When this happens, the only way to stop it from being a problem is to suppress the immune system, and so individuals who receive donated kidneys need to be on lifelong immunosuppressants. If that doesn't happen, they're likely to find themselves dying in a very slow and painful manner, as the kidney stimulates the immune system, causing system-wide inflammation, and then gradual but certain destruction of the kidney, followed possibly by either complete organ failure, autoimmune diseases, or systemic issues causing their quality of life to plummet. There is a very big caveat that comes at the end of all this promising news. That is that there were initially 20 monkeys involved in this study. Of the 20 monkeys, one group received kidneys with 0 genetic modification. They died within 50 days, so that's clearly showing that you need modifications in order for this to work. Of the other groups, there were varying degrees of modification of the kidney received. Some received some of the genes, and others received all 7 of the human genes that were needed. Of the group that received the full range of genetic modification, 5 lived for more than a year, and 1 lived for more than 2 years. That is at least promising news. The slightly more promising news is that, at least in theory, there isn't a need for 2 kidneys to be transplanted. The clinical data shows that a single kidney appears to perform as well as 2 natural kidneys would, so the 1 pig kidney is equivalent to 2 monkey kidneys. Although there is a question whether or not this counts as a xenotransplant, given that it's a pig to a monkey, or if it is another word more appropriate for what would normally be a animal to human transplant, which is a xenotransplant, although not the fun kind of xenotransplant. Shifting to case study news, and an 80-year-old woman who found a bizarre object lodged in her brain. The 80-year-old Russian woman found that she had a needle in her brain after a CT scan, which is fortunate. It would have been rather messy and likely fatal if they'd found this during an MRI. The woman and doctors believe that it was a case of failed infanticide carried out by her parents, and given that this would have been in the roughly 1940s to 1950s period, she probably would have died during one of Russia's famines, and as a result, trying to kill the child would have made sense, but the fact that they failed to kill her is, well, not good. Strangely though, they're not going to try and remove the needle, and that's for a very simple reason. The needle's location, and the fact that it's been there for as long as it has, means that it would likely be a failure to remove it, and not just a failure in terms of their inability to remove the roughly 2.5 centimeter or 1 inch needle, but that it would likely significantly impair her brain function and worsen her condition. In less disconcerting news, we have a interesting article from The Guardian, although that's perhaps a kind way to describe The Guardian. In this case, it's about the Ice Plunge Challenge, the ALS challenge that's been touted over recent years. The issue is how much benefit there really is, and the fact that there are some very real risks associated with it. That's because individuals have increasingly used it as a means of generating clout for themselves, and once they have that clout, they then claim it can treat all kinds of other things, rather than just being a means of raising funds for ALS research. Individuals have claimed that it can benefit people in terms of weight loss, depression, and boosting immunity, although none of these are true, and, well, it's just a load of crap. Weight loss is going to be a possibility, but only if you have extended exposure to cold, given that shivering is a way to stimulate heat loss, although not a good way. Depression won't improve except as a means of generating clout for those who are trying to tout this nonsense, and punishing your body by putting it into a cold environment like this is not going to help your immune system. Rather, it's likely to make your body more stressed and depress your immune system. Ice water baths are being touted as a means of improving people's health, and as a result, various individuals and groups are trying to sell them as a service. The problem is that people are actually dying or having serious adverse health events as a result of this. This includes actual death, but more importantly, the fact that you are putting someone into a hypothermic environment. This means that the body will try and respond to that perceived threat, and that perceived threat is not insignificant. you're taking the human body, putting it into 12 degrees water, where the human body likes to try and maintain a temperature between 36 and 38 degrees. Operating too far outside of this range, mostly below 25 degrees Celsius, will lead to issues around the body entering shock. When this happens, the body then tries to compensate. It increases heart rate, blood pressure goes up, respiration changes, and there are all sorts of hormones that the body puts out to try and compensate. And that's the problem here. You're suddenly triggering this compensation mechanism, and if there are any underlying health issues, there's a significantly greater chance of something happening, and it's not good. If this was just the individuals themselves who are responsible for touting this nonsense engaging in it, we'd put it down to natural selection. But no, they're not only selling it as a service, but they're promoting other individuals to take part, particularly on TikTok, but TikTok is not the only source of bad health information. Even if you were to base your perception of this on historical evidence, there's not a great deal to support it other than cultural practices. And even in the modern world, there is a heavy reliance on anecdotes to support it. None of these things really show evidence, as anecdotes are not evidence. They're just an individual's perception of things, and they're often incredibly biased. In actual historical news that is based on slightly more substantial cultural practices, although, again, there are some significant caveats, we have the surprising and very disconcerting normality of cannibalism. The research, however, is largely limited to Northern Europe, so we can at least say that there's not as much insanity attached to this, and certainly not as much a risk. The research focuses on a period about 15,000 years ago in Europe, and the culture called the Magdalenian culture. What they've found is that a part of funerary practices or behaviours, they would consume their dead rather than bury them. It does take the expression waste not, want not to an extreme. The key caveat to these findings is that there's not actually a lot of evidence, and particularly around the funerary practices of these people. As such, even the authors themselves admit that they're interpreting the results, not explicitly linking the results to given events, and, more importantly, able to extrapolate those results out. One of the interesting phenomena that was derived from this is that the Magdalenian culture died out several thousand years earlier than other similar contemporaneous cultures, particularly the Epigravitan culture. This would indicate that the practice may not in and of itself led to their gradual but sure decline, but it also would indicate that it may have been a contributing factor, much the same way that cannibalism in more recent cultures has led to extensive and rather substantial health issues, largely prion diseases, effectively mad cow disease, but the human equivalent. In animal news that's related to something like mad cow disease, we have avian influenza and genetic modification of chickens to make it possible for them to resist infection. Over recent months, and arguably over the last year or so, there has been an increasing outbreak of avian influenza, not just in China where it appears to have originated, but in other countries as well. This has led to a rather brutal but very simple solution: culling all the chickens and cremating the remains so that the virus can't spread. The reason why they've had to do this is very simple. Avian influenza can jump from birds to pigs and then humans. In some instances, it's avoided the middleman entirely and jumped straight from chickens to humans. The upside to this is that at least those humans that have been infected have yet to be able to pass on the infection to other humans. So it seems to be a duration and extent of exposure rather than just a ability to infect. Since avian influenza is particularly nasty for humans, this leads to the inevitable need to try and cut it off and prevent it from spreading. After all, we don't want a repeat of something like the H1N1. This is where very simple solutions can come in handy, and it's the same sort of solutions we've used for most agricultural things. In this case, genetically modify the chickens so that they're more resistant to avian influenza. 9 of the 10 birds that they did this with appear to have no indication of infection when exposed to the virus at doses that would otherwise normally occur, and that's important here. If we can cut down and reduce the extent and duration of infection in chickens, the chances of it being able to not only make the jump from species, but more importantly, continue to spread amongst the reservoir, the chickens in this case, the chances of it becoming another zoonoses like COVID-19 or avian influenza go down drastically. It's exactly the same idea as with humans and vaccines. It's why certain diseases, for example polio, aren't an issue anymore. Because humanity was able to stop the spread of the disease, it gradually but surely died out. And as a result, we no longer need to worry about it being an issue. Unlike humanity's attempts to curtail the spread of various infectious agents like viruses, this was not universally effective, and because it could not completely block the spread of the disease, we would need to work on that before it could be rolled out to farms and used as a standard approach. And the reason for that is very simple. Viruses will adapt to any adverse scenario they find themselves in, and even if they don't adapt and evolve, they'll mutate randomly anyway, and because they mutate, they then find ways to work around any roadblocks you put in front of them. If you have a smaller subset of the virus that can survive despite being exposed to these barriers, they're more likely to find ways to overcome them. It's natural selection in practice. This is also where the second part of this problem comes into play. If you have a normal scenario where you have standard doses, you're likely to be able to witness the gradual evolution of the virus over time. But if you're in a situation where there's an outbreak and you have very high doses, you're likely to see the infection find its way through any kind of barrier that you put in front of it very quickly. And that's also similar to what the researchers found. Even with the genetic modification, when they exposed the chickens to high doses, half the chickens still had an infection occur. You may have also immediately thought of the idea of vaccinating chickens rather than genetically modifying them, and this is likely to be a contentious point to make, but the idea of vaccinating them isn't viable, and that's because the virus changes, just the same as the human influenza virus changes. And because of this, and the fact that it changes too suddenly and too frequently, there's no practical way to develop a vaccine against it. This means that the only way to break the cycle of infection, spreading the infection, and then the continued spread to new susceptible hosts, is to stop the host from being susceptible. The only concern, let's say, that will come from this approach at present is, well, exactly the same problem as with the virus now, and what we've already described. That is, by creating barriers in the form of preventing the animal from being susceptible to the current approach that the avian influenza strains take, we're likely to favor the emergence of new strains that use other means of infecting the host. Shifting from uncomfortable and disconcerting animal news to at least slightly more entertaining animal news, Australia has provided more evidence that it is a bizarre country that really does defy any and all sense. A low-flying helicopter caused crocodiles to start becoming incredibly horny and hump anything and everything in sight. As the helicopter went overhead, it made noise, and so that seemed to signal somehow to the crocodiles that it was time to mate. Unfortunately, this was on a crocodile farm, and as a result, the crocodiles all went mad with the intention to find new friends, let's say.
Dude, wait, hold on, wait a second. This is gay. This is really gay. Yeah, this is even gayer than all the men getting in a big pile and having sex with each other. Okay, sorry, my bad. Everyone back in the pile.
Back in the pile, everyone! We're going back to the pile.
Jump in!
Come on, everybody! We're going back to the pile.
Yeah, come on.
The current theory is that the 3,000 or so crocodiles mistook the helicopter's sounds and vibrations for a thunderstorm, and that the thunderstorms in that area of Australia coincide with the right time of year to reproduce for the optimal survival chance. This may have also been a rather unexpected and uncomfortable surprise for the farm operators. Going from the animals in nature to environment more broadly, but also weirdly not, we have Lego and the fact that Lego has chosen to pivot away from its existing plans to use existing bottles and other plastics to produce their blocks. And the reason for this is quite simple. After they examined the process of taking existing plastics and applying them to the necessary technologies and processes to create their product, the environmental impact was more significant than creating brand new blocks by just using fossil fuels. No, this isn't ideal, but they have been able to assess it, and they've been able to explain that if you take the plastics that are recycled and you try and convert them into usable plastic, it's simply more expensive, more energy consuming, and requires more material than if they just made them from scratch. This is particularly important as the European Union and other parts of the world are looking to bring in more stringent and onerous and difficult supply chain requirements. This will be things like creating a more circular economy where more things are recycled. This is also sometimes called a cradle-to-grave approach, that being the initial generation of products right through to when they are destroyed or recycled. And this is where Lego was able to get a better understanding of what's going on. They looked at the 3 steps of their, let's say, chain of products. That being their own productions, the production of all the precursors required and everything that's involved in that, and finally, what's involved once they finish producing it, and then the distribution or sale of it. This is where Lego is slightly different to other companies, and where they were able to get a better grasp about what they're doing and the issues around it. They were looking at largely the 3rd step, that is the environmental issues associated with the transportation, distribution, and sale of their products, and then what happens when the products come to their end of life. The only downside is that this appears to have been largely driven by ESG, that being environment, social, and governance. This is a term often touted as a means of basically covering up bullshit discrimination practices that don't make any sense, or changing policies to favour bizarre options. Nonetheless, they've at least been able to explain it in a way that makes sense, other than the usual nonsensical statements associated with ESG. That is, in this case, the products are more expensive to make, and this would be what will make the investors happy. From a governance perspective, this is the right decision. It is what is best from a business perspective. It is best from an economic perspective, and as a result, there is a certain social benefit. In terms of similar phenomena, we have the tech conference that was geared towards women, and this is fine in theory, after all. If you want to make a conference that is intended to be for women, go for your life. The problem here is that, well, there was a surprising number of individuals who self-identified as female, although the organisers claim they were male.
I can't tell you how free I feel now that I've started identifying as a woman. Now that I can compete as female, I'm ready to smash the other girls.
And is it correct you just started identifying as female 2 weeks ago?
I'm not here to talk about my transition.
The problem with this is that it is the obvious and foreseeable response to embracing and enacting ESG. That is, by actively discriminating against one sex, that same sex will start pushing back. And in this case, it's by looking at the terms and conditions and realizing that they don't actually need to be female, they just need to identify as female. It's exactly the same sort of phenomena that happened with the weightlifting male who identified as a female purely and solely to break records. This is where 404 Media manages to simultaneously recognize the underlying issue and still get it wrong. As they point out, data from the National Science Foundation has 20% of computer science degrees in the USA awarded to women versus the 80% awarded to males. And this is similarly represented in the people on panels and attending conferences. Yet they complain that there was a large representation of men at a conference intended to support women, which, if the idea is to have more women there, you wouldn't be surprised to find that even if you want more women present, there would still be a large number of men. That is simply a relationship to the number of people with the degrees relevant to what was happening. If you have a representation of the computer science field in terms of population, even if you have more women there who are going there specifically because it is targeted towards women, and you want men there to support them, you would expect to see more men showing up. The issue here is that the number of men who are there who are claiming to be females, which is, to be quite blunt about it, kinda dickish. But of course, all of that assumes that what is being reported is correct. According to 404 Media, the number of men there who had lanyards indicating that they were male was the majority, and so it would indicate that a significant number were not lying about their sex when they signed up for said conference. That would indicate that what has been described as the, let's say, rationale behind the increase in male attendance isn't necessarily accurate. In fact, it may be that they're attributing something to this without evidence to support it. Even the conference organisers claimed that there were a number of men lying about their gender when they're registering for the event in question, but this doesn't seem to match with what is being observed in practice. Although this is described as a problem, they at least recognize that it's actually necessary to have men involved in this in order to lead towards a conversation and ideally a solution. And so, even if they arguably are overstating the nature of the problem in terms of registration, they also recognize the need to have men there and to work with them as part of the environment that is, well, what they're trying to establish. There are other issues that they report, although, much like other events, this is all very much anecdotal, and anecdotes, as already stated, are not data. They are solely and completely the individual's experience or description of an experience, and therefore unreliable. In terms of somewhat more substantial research, at least, we have bizarre studies involving lightning, although not the fun kind where you're trying to resurrect the dead. Rather, it's deflecting lightning using a laser. The Swiss research used a laser to try and deflect the lightning strike towards a lightning rod and therefore control where the lightning would strike. The underlying principle is rather straightforward but difficult to execute. The idea is very simple in that you heat the air, and by heating the air, you cause it to release electrons. Lightning will follow these electrons and therefore try to get towards the laser, which has been the source of the heated air and therefore released electrons. Since it gets closer and closer to the laser, positioned near the lightning rod, it's going to follow the path to an extent towards that and then veer off to go to the lightning rod. The idea here is not just that you can make the laser beam work this way. The challenge is actually the laser beam itself. A laser powerful enough to do this is not only time consuming but also very energy intensive. Therefore, running it constantly is really hard. The trick now is to fire the laser off in pulses, but one pulse every now and then is just not going to do the job. It's not enough. What they've done is to fire that pulse 1,000 times a second. It means they don't need to constantly run the laser, but they are firing it frequently enough that, well, it works. The only downside, so to say, with this research is that it's really only based on a single phenomena that was captured, and that's a bit of a problem. One data point is not data, it is effectively an anecdote. Shifting to astronomical news, and in this case, talking about the ISS. Notably that parts of the ISS built by Russia are, yet again, causing problems. Largely, it's the leaking of a coolant this time. Previously, there were issues around other things, but there are more and more parts of it that seem to be failing. The failure this time is part of the backup coolant system that's available on that module, and although at present there is no danger to the crew on board, it's still a concern. Importantly, it is the backup system that has failed, not the primary functioning system, although that is a concern if it should fail. A possibility that grows with every subsequent issue that occurs. Once is a random occurrence, twice is unfortunate, 3 times is a pattern, and this is the third failure, indicating that there is a pattern of problems being caused by the Russian systems. Shifting to other news in space, but also about lasers, we have the idea of using lasers to build paths and roads on the moon, although this is a very optimistic idea. The problem with this is not necessarily the road itself. Rather, it is that the lunar paths and roads would be very similar to backcountry roads made out of dirt. As you were to travel along them, they would throw up small amounts of dust, effectively small particles that often carry either the ability to clog systems, or, importantly, if they're charged, cause sparks and other electrical hazards to occur. As a result, the idea of using a laser would be enough to cause these small particles to ideally fall back to the ground and therefore no longer be a, let's say, a hazard. Conceptually, this isn't actually a crazy or novel idea. It's very much the same idea as sintering on Earth, that is by taking a powdered metal, shining a very powerful laser on it, and melting it together. And that's what they intend to do here, just on a much larger scale. Although it is German research, so it's no surprise that they're over-engineering a solution to something that could otherwise be relatively basic. The reason we describe it as an over-engineered solution is that the German researchers have created an analog of moon surface material. They've then tried to develop a analog for a giant magnifying glass that would use sunlight that can be focused down to a small area, somewhere in the range of 45mm or just under 2 inches. This giant magnifying glass would be able to take sunlight and melt the surface of the moon in the exact same manner that, well, a sintering laser would. The difference here is that unlike a sintering laser, which is often used to create a single layer of something, then melt another layer on top of that, and so on, this would instead create a series of repeating patterns that would lock together. Why it wouldn't just melt them in a series of blocks going along the road, much like bricks or expanding concrete areas, is confusing, but hey, German engineering at its finest. In order to get this giant magnifying glass, they would need an area of about 2.4 meters or just under 26 feet. A square, mind you, not by length. In short, the German engineers have effectively created a design for a giant magnifying glass that would need to be shipped to the moon, although compared to other technology it may not be as difficult to do so. They then have decided to create a series of repeating patterns, and they want to lock these together to create a road of sorts, and in doing so they would be able to minimize the debris and dust that be thrown up into the air. Yeah. Germany might be looking to expand into Poland once more, given that they're beginning to over-engineer once more. The final news item we have for you this week is all about a new way of testing for artificial intelligence. Most people would know of the Turing test, that being a test designed to establish whether or not an AI is able to fool a human into believing that the AI is also a human. This is a very old test by modern standards, being developed in the 1950s by, well, unsurprisingly, Alan Turing, given the name. The Tong test is a development on this. This is where Steve Novella from the Neurologica blog provides us with a new way of figuring out whether or not AI at least has a general intelligence rather than being specifically intelligent like the Turing test is intended to figure out. Mostly because the Turing test is not really designed to establish the abilities of an AI, rather whether or not the AI is close enough to a human to fool us. Since most AIs now, at a certain level, like ChatGPT and similar levels of artificial intelligence, have the requisite ability to assemble all the things that Turing thought would be beyond an AI, a new test is being generated to figure out whether or not, well, for lack of a better way of phrasing this, the AI has the necessary ability to go beyond the scope of just creating something randomly. And this is the Tong test. Not so much named after an individual, but for a character. Where the Turing test tries to differentiate between two actors and see which one is an AI, and enough of the time to fool the assessor, the Tong test is looking more at what it's able to do beyond that. In short, can it demonstrate a degree of sentience? The test itself has 5 pillars on which it operates. One is an infinite task generating system. That is, can it continue to complete new tasks that aren't related to anything else it has already done? Does it have a value system? That is it able to understand physical or social rules? The self-generated tasks, which are, can it both execute values of internal and external values? Can it generate the tasks that it needs to do? And more importantly, can it understand how the universe works? By that we mean causality. And then finally, there's a degree of embodiment needed. That is, does it exist as a discrete entity? That is, if you had ChatGPT, could ChatGPT operate without input from a human, which at present it can't. Novella does add an interesting layer to this, and it's certainly one that's worth considering. That is, like with the movie Ex Machina, it is better to be able to figure out whether or not the machine also has a theory of mind. That is, can the system, the AI, show consciousness and demonstrate the understanding of others' consciousness? This would be not only amazing if true, but also kind of terrifying. Amazing in that AIs have essentially become humans, so, for lack of a better comparison, we have become our own god by creating life. By the other token, terrifying in that if we ever apply the notion of what happens in Terminator to AI, we're likely doomed. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.